They redoubled their efforts to sell us processed food. They were resisted for a long time. A lot of, when they marketed to women, who were doing most of the cooking, of course, women would say, well, of all the housework, cooking is actually the part I like best. It's my creative outlet. If someone can help with the ironing, great. But they kept at it. And their opening really came in the 60s and 70s when women went to work in large numbers and the feminist revolution took place. And what happened was very interesting there. And this could be easily misinterpreted, and it has been by some people, as blaming feminism for the collapse of home cooking. That's actually not what happened at all. What happened is that when feminism arrived on the scene and women were working, there was a very awkward conversation that unfolded on kitchen tables all over the West, which was, we need to renegotiate the division of labor in the home. If women were going to be working, they couldn't also be expected to do all the cooking, all the childcare, and all the housework. And I know, I was party to some of these conversations, and they were very tense and not happy. And other people here were party to them as well. And the food industry saw this wonderful opportunity. And they said, in effect, through their advertising, stop arguing. We've got you covered. We'll do it for you. We'll do the cooking. And the metaphor of this campaign, which took place in many companies over many years, was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, which took out billboards in the early 70s across America with a giant bucket of fried chicken, the red thing with the 14 pieces of chicken popping out of the top, and just a two-word slogan, women's liberation. It's very, very clever, because they redefined not cooking, which was kind of in disrepute before this, as the progressive thing to do, and forward-looking, and that we should industrialize our cooking, take it off the table at home. And men grabbed at this, and women grabbed at this, because it essentially solved a problem. Once again, create an anxiety, solve a problem. And that is, in large part, what happened. And women who weren't working, also, their rates of home cooking fell as well. Because the image of not cooking had been changed in this profound way. So that's kind of how we got where we still are. They've gotten more and more clever. Processing, when we talk about processed food, there really are, two orders of processed food. I think it's important to distinguish. There is what is sometimes called hyper-processed or ultra-processed food. And there's a very interesting conversation around this in food studies circles. And then there's first-order processed food, which is, unobjectionable. I mean, freezing vegetables, is a terrific product. Canning tomatoes, milling flour. All these things, although we can talk about white flour, all these things, that's what processed food was until the last couple decades, when processing reached new heights of complexity and the ability to make whole, ready meals in great amounts. And I have to stress the problem, again, with this kind of cooking is that the kinds of ingredients, salt, fat, and sugar, key. Also, lots of food additives. As soon as you're cooking food en masse to have such a long shelf life, you need a lot of chemicals to keep it looking as though it were cooked more recently and closer by than it really was. And so you need emulsifiers to keep your sauce from separating, because it can look pretty nasty without these chemicals. And so corporate cooking uses lots of chemicals that no ordinary mortal has in their pantry. You probably don't have polysorbate 80 in your pantry or xanthan gum unless you're a molecular gastronome. So you have this whole range of chemicals, which actually, even though we've been lulled into thinking they're all right, there are serious questions about these dyes and these flavorings. And as we're learning about the gut microbiome and the importance of this interior fermentation in our large intestine to our health, there's starting to be very important questions raised about some of those food additives and what they do to the bacteria that we depend on. And then the last point about corporate cooking that's important to understand is they cook different stuff than you do at home. What they're good at, in general, they don't cook that well, but things like chips, They cook incredibly well. And here's a classic food that if you make it yourself, if you've ever made French fries, pardon me if I call them French fries, you have to wash the potatoes, you have to peel the potatoes, you have to slice the potatoes, you have to fry them in a lot of oil, you have to spatter your entire stovetop, you have to clean up, and then you have this pot of oil you have to get rid of. I mean, it's really difficult, and it's a pain. They're wonderful, but it's a pain. And if you make them yourself, you'll only eat them every 6 weeks, 2 months, because it's too much work. But when you let corporations cook for you, it's so simple and so inexpensive, and they're really good, that you will have them twice a day, as many people in America do. So you see the kinds of foods you end up with are these labor-intensive foods and desserts. These special occasion foods become everyday foods when we let industry cook for us. In the course of my research, I spent a lot of time with a food marketing consultant. I'm just going to tell this story and then sit down. A food marketing consultant called Harry Balzer. And he is a man, wonderful name, isn't it? He's a man who has been studying our consumer habits for his whole career. He works for a market research firm in Chicago called NPD. They're kind of the Nielsen ratings of food. And he's, in effect, been, in his own way, working to dismantle the culture of home cooking, about which he sees no future at all. He thinks that cooking in another generation will be regarded as quaintly as quilt making is in ours. And he has a very, like most people who study marketing, has a pretty cynical view of human nature. And he really thinks that we're just too cheap and too lazy, and if corporations can do this, we will let them do it. But he fully understands the cost of going down this path. And we talked a lot about, well, what about the obesity epidemic? And what about type 2 diabetes? And this is a man, you know, I'm talking to a voice who's in the belly of the big food beast. And he said, you want to know the diet for America, the one diet that would work? And I'm like, yeah, I take out my pad and I start making notes. He says, eat anything you want, just cook it yourself. And you know, there's a real wisdom in that. There really is. It can solve a multitude of problems. It causes some problems too. And we can talk about time and all the impediments to cooking, but it solves the big problem. So I'm going to leave it there and join Tim for a conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, you heard the reasons why you wrote the book, but what you didn't get there is the book.
Right.
I'll test my skills. The book is a very clever, multi-layered bit of writing. It's very easy. He's a beautiful writer. If you don't know his writing, do have a look at it, read it. It's at one level classical. I liked it. My mother was a classicist. I was brought up to revere. Here we are, by the way, in the most beautiful room with a classical painting. And he takes the four elements, the ancient Greek elements, fire, water, etc., air, and then weaves a story about different versions of using those as cooking. And then in each of these four parts of the book, talks about particular people. You see, he's a beautiful journalist. He unpicks people, gets them to tell their life stories, and gives you archetypes of people who have knowledge. I thought this book was about knowledge. Skills. What skills does one need to live in the modern world? That is actually what I thought you were. I wrote down the 4 questions I'd ask Michael with you. I think he's asking a question certainly I agree with. What is food progress? And we've had in the 20th century a remarkable experiment with progress.
Yeah.
And redefining progress. The second thing his book does is weave science and knowledge together. It says domestic knowledge has been disparaged, seen as the past, not progress, domestic. The debate about women and food being an example. You didn't actually quote one of my favorite sets of American feminists in the 1890s. They were arguing about, Is progress to have centralized kitchens?
Right.
All of that. And in Sweden, that took off. Centralized kitchens built for communal living and so on. And here we have Michael in the 21st century basically saying cooking is about creativity and control. And if we don't know how to do it, we're not human.
And we lose control of our lives. I mean,
Yeah.
the subtext of this book, just to clarify what you said about the elements, one of the things I was trying to do, as I do in all my work, this is not a book full of 28-minute recipes to help you get dinner on the table. So don't look for that. Other people have that base covered.
There are 4 recipes at the end.
But there are
book.
4 recipes, but they're complicated and long.
They're very complicated.
But wonderful
very
in their
nice.
own way. But so I was, as I always do in my work, I tried to get down to the essence of something. I mean, the essence of agriculture. Is it about, are we using the sun or are we using oil to grow our food? Just take it all the way down to the basic, the elements. And what I found in the case of cooking was that almost all kinds of cooking, regardless of culture, fell into one of 4 transformations. There was the one with fire, the most basic, putting an animal over a fire. There was water, which is cooking in pots over a fire, which is a completely different technology that allows you to cook very different kinds of things, and is really the basis of world gastronomy. And
Civilization.
yeah, and although civilization, you could argue, can begin before that with the fire. Agriculture depends on that pot with water, because you can soften grain, you can make porridges. And then air is bread, the baking of bread, which is an incredibly important innovation that happens about 6,000 years ago, and really allows us to subsist on grass seeds, wheat. And other grasses, and we can explain how that is. And then earth, I talk about fermentation. This is kind of the most miraculous transformation of all. This is cooking without the use of any heat whatsoever, but simply using microbes, bacteria and fungi, to process our food and make kimchi and sauerkraut, pickles, cheese, which is fermented milk, yogurt, and alcohol, a very important fermentation. And so I basically kind of, in each case, apprenticed myself to one or several masters, great artisans, who had a great feeling for how this work is done, and were willing to transmit, as you say, their knowledge, because a lot of this knowledge is getting lost. The knowledge of how to make a beautiful whole grain bread is virtually extinct, and the knowledge of how to mill whole grain flour well, virtually extinct, coming back right now, and that's one of the more encouraging things going on in the world right now. So anyway, just to give you a sense, and so the book is really an education. It's my progress from idiot to, I wouldn't say expert, but reasonably competent.
But he ends the book with what I thought he would start it with when I got the book. He ends with saying that food is actually, and cooking is about taste. And taste is the precursor to love. And there's a very interesting, it's a very personal book, by the way. Lots about himself and his wife and son and learning together. It's in a great sort of Emersonian tradition, actually, if I can say.
Well, he is a hero.
Yeah, I thought he might be.
There's, at the end, Tim's talking about taste. I had this very interesting exchange with I went to Korea to learn how to make kimchi. They're the great fermenters of Napa cabbage.
Has anyone here eaten kimchi?
Oh, excellent.
Well, this is a very elite audience.
Yes.
Webinar people, I tell you, you wouldn't go into many audience with half of them putting up their hands. I had to suffer eating kimchi 3 times a day for 10 days. By the end, I loved it. When I started, I hated it.
Why did you start?
Because I was doing a tour of organic agriculture in Korea in the monsoon period, and that's all there was to eat.
You could have done worse.
Yeah, no, it was
I
nice.
love kimchi.
Yeah, I liked it.
And we're learning that it has, enormous health benefits.
I think there's good and bad kimchi.
That is true.
I had the agricultural college's kimchi.
Oh.
It was
but anyway, I went to Seoul, and this woman who makes traditional kimchi, and she, by the way, right away said, well, there are 275 different kimchis in Korea. I'm teaching you one. Okay, that's all I'm going to learn. And while we're working, and it was a very painstaking process the way she was making it. You take the Napa cabbage and you put it in a brine overnight so it gets limp and draw the water out of it. And then you don't chop it up in this case. You make a spice paste of your garlic and ginger and red peppers, and you individually massage every leaf between every layer of each Napa cabbage with this red paste. And then you fold it just so, and you put it in the bottom of the urn, and the urn goes outside and gets buried. And the whole time we're working, we're on our knees on these tatami mats, and we're speaking through a translator. And she says, well, you know, there's two kinds of taste. There's hand taste and tongue taste. And I'm like, huh? What? It didn't make any sense. And I thought it was the translator making a mistake. But she started talking about it. She said, well, tongue taste, anyone can do. Tongue taste is just the dance of molecules on your tongue. You can simulate flavor. McDonald's can do tongue taste just fine, but hand taste is very special. Hand taste is the taste of a food that has been made with incredible care and affection and love. And you can tell that when you have that. You've had that food in a restaurant where you know it's been cooked with complete conviction. And she said, that's what we're building here. We were building hand taste. And I took that away with me as a measure of really great cooking. It's not complexity, it's not dexterity or dazzling us. It's having that quality. And I look for that. It's hard to find, of course.
I will now ask one question and then hand to you, the audience. I try when reading a book to always think, well, what would the critics say? And I think a lot. But
I would never get anything written if I thought that way.
No. I think you would. The criticism is this is a fantasy world. This is a fantasy world of anti-progress. Let's go back to that. It's a fantasy world where busy, urbanized, deracinated people can somehow become artisanal experts. That's the nasty criticism, that this is inappropriate, let me lay it on.
Sure.
Romantic, elite, here we are two professors, well paid, can do this sort of thing, telling the masses to cook when actually they're voting with their feet through market economics.
My answer? Well, you know, there are worse things being accused of than being idealistic.
Yeah, good answer.
But that's not my whole answer.
No, I hope not.
It seems insurmountable that we could ever return to a culture of home cooking. And first, it's very important to say it can't be a return. We can't go back. We can never go back. The idea that we would go back implies that women would go back into the home, and in a way they were there before. We actually, if we're going to rebuild a culture of cooking, it's going to have to be with women and men and children, most importantly, children. We're really letting our kids off the hook on chores and work in the household. I think it's a tremendous mistake we're all making, not to equip them with these skills. Look, we have a choice. We're at a fork in the road. We are being encouraged to live our lives in this consumer capitalist economy in such a way that we do one thing that we call work, and that's our job, and we produce value there, and then we take that money and we use it to outsource everything else, turn every other part of our lives, except for what we call leisure, into an occasion for consumption. That's what the market wants us to do. They want to do everything they can figure out a profitable way to do. If they could reach down your throats and digest your food for you, and they could do that profitably, they would. And the question
called
is,
the pharmaceutical industry, actually. It's done.
It is done. It is. There are more products like that.
The fusion of the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry is one of the things that's likely to happen.
Well,
actually.
that's right. We are going down that
Drink your
path.
water and carry on your answer.
This is a sad, dependent, debilitating way to live. Leisure should not only be defined as those things which the market hasn't figured out a way to do for you, like watching television. You can't outsource that. Going to the gym, you can't outsource that. Be stupid. Going to the yoga class, all these things. But work, production, to take some of that back with our leisure time is, I find when I do it, one of the most rewarding ways to spend time. That to contribute to your own, the support of your own body and that of your family is remarkably rewarding, not to mention good for you in various ways. And so if this book has a subtext, it's really a manifesto in favor of changing the balance of consumption and production in your life and getting away from this idea that if it can be outsourced, that's the smart thing to do. Now, we are under enormous time pressure. There's no question. We work too hard. In America, we made a tremendous mistake, I think, with our labor movement. We fought for money. We didn't fight for time. In parts of Europe, the fight was very much for time.
It was about time.
And in many countries, especially in the Scandinavian countries, but also in Germany, they really fought for time. And they have really good family leave, and couples can split jobs or work 3/4 time, and a whole lot of policies that are conducive to home cooking.
They here are called European.
Yeah, that's right, European, sorry.
This is what we in Britain are against.
Right, of course.
Yeah. But you're right.
And so I do think there are things we need to do to change the rules of the game to make home cooking easier for everybody.
Yeah.
But to say it's an elite concern, I think, is a mistake. Cooking is incredibly economical. Incredibly economical. Whatever you might think, looking at how cheap fast food is, it's cheaper to make it yourself. The challenge is time. And there are many strategic ways you can deal with that, but one is to share the work. I think the nuclear family was really bad for cooking in a way because it isolated women with this work. And I found in my own life, getting the whole family in the kitchen is really important. And also, frankly, just being strategic about it and making a couple meals on a Sunday so that I enter the week, if I have a busy day, there's something in the fridge that's really good, and doubling up on what I cook. If I'm roasting a chicken, I usually roast 2. It's no more work, and suddenly you've got a couple meals taken care of. So we're very quick to go to that place where this is impossible. And all I would do is challenge you to think about it. Think about how you do use your time. We make time for the things we deem important. All I'm suggesting is this is one of those things.
Very good. That was a good answer. I asked him a question.
Thank you, Professor.
I can mark you. I think I'll give you 9 out of 10 for that one. Quite good, but you could try harder. Okay, over to you. We've got 22 minutes. Can you say who you are?
And stand up, perhaps?
And stand up, yep, okay. You don't need to curtsy.
Hello.
Hello.
Is it
Hello.
working?
Yep, you can hear
Is
you.
there any correlation between class and cooking?
Can you say who you are?
Helen Ellery.
Any correlation between
Is there
class
any
and cooking?
correlation between class and cooking? I'm sure that there is in many, many ways. One of the things that's important to remember is that much of the technique that we call cooking was developed very often by the poor, figuring out ways to wring maximal nutrition from inexpensive and often waste bits of food. And so the whole French culinary tradition is very much about how you use the worst cuts of meat to make the most delicious food. And you peel back the history and you don't find great chefs, you find peasants developing these techniques because they didn't have access to the good joint of meat and that could simply be roasted. So there's a lot of wisdom in the peasant class around food. Today, I mean, but what exactly is the question? I mean, who's cooking more and less?
Yeah, because I'm wondering if people are challenged now by how much they can afford to cook good food, and they bypass the cooking process onto processed food
Yeah,
because
you're right.
they can't.
And it
more
seems
so today,
economical. And it is if you're not cooking often. I think one of the problems is if you're cooking one meal and you buy that head of broccoli or that, head of cabbage, and you have leftovers, it's actually hard to price it because you usually are buying ingredients that can go into several meals. But in fact, a lot of work has been done looking at how cheap processed food is, and it's not as cheap as it looks. It's also not as convenient as it looks. But fresh food is intimidating to people because you're worried about waste. So very often, if you are cooking one meal, that processed food looks really tempting. We did an experiment when I was working on this book. My son came up with this, and we were doing all this home cooking, and he was a little sick of it, and he was like, let's go to the supermarket, and we'll all get a microwavable
Microwave meal.
And we called it Microwave Night.
It's a great bit of the book, actually.
My son there were so many things he wanted. He got two. He got a onion soup gratin and a Shanghai-style hoisin beef. And I got a vegetarian curry, and my wife got a lasagna. And we went to, so the first thing about it to note is that it cost $27, this cheap microwavable meal night, which you could buy grass-fed beef in the farmer's market, a cheap cut, and braise it with vegetables, for $27. You could get 2 nights' food out of that. The other thing that was kind of striking about it was that it took an hour to get this quick meal on the table, because it's the nature of the microwave oven. It's highly individualistic technology. If you compare it to the casserole or the cook fire, you can only do one at a time, so by the time the fourth one comes out, the first one is cold. And we spent the meal, it was the most disjointed meal we've ever had, just, everybody getting up from the table to zap their food. I mean, the microwave is the Ayn Rand of appliances. I mean, it's just every man for himself. So the assumptions in your question need to be questioned. Whether it really is cheap to eat processed food. Under some circumstances, it is. Very often when you go to McDonald's, the burgers are cheap because they're actually selling them at a loss because they make so much money on the soda. So if you just buy the stuff that's subsidized by the soda, yeah, you might come out ahead. But in general, I've read studies where people have actually made a fast food meal, and it turns out that they can make it more cheaply if you're making enough of it. And so it isn't necessarily true. In terms of rates of home cooking, I don't know. I haven't seen information correlating it by class.
Yeah, my colleague Martin Carra has written endlessly, if you want the answer for Britain. There is a correlation between class and cooking. Let's have the person here. Can you wait for the microphone and say who you are?
I'm Johnny Gray, and I'm a kitchen designer and visiting professor of design and kitchen culture at Bucks University. Great. I'm itching to ask 2 totally different questions. Hard to start off, but the first one is, have you got any comments or observations about kitchen design in relation to trying to promote home cooking?
And the second question, do you want the second question?
What's the second one?
Oh, the second one is,
I like it better.
I know a little bit more about what's going on in the US because I work in the US quite a lot, and I'm intrigued about what kind of advice you're giving the Obama administration to reduce obesity and promote home cooking.
Okay.
2 small questions.
Yeah, I'll try to do them fast. Well, we went through an interesting, there's a couple things going on in kitchen design. One is, of course, kitchens are display now. People who don't cook at all have the most beautiful kitchens. There's this weird paradox, right? With the 6-burner Viking stoves and the giant, stainless steel hoods. It's kind of weird. And that speaks to this larger issue I address. I call it the cooking paradox, an obsession with cooking at the same time, on television, in restaurants, in kitchen design. At the same time, we're not doing it anymore, which is peculiar. But one of the things that we learned, because we redid our kitchen a few years ago, is that we designed it in such a way that it is with an eye toward multiple people cooking at the same time. And many, especially small galley situations, are very hard for 2 or 3, especially 3, to cook at the same time. So our kitchen has a big island in the middle where actually 4 or 5 people could all chop at the same time. And we also can eat there. We eat breakfast and lunch there. And so this island, so I think that there are ways to, we had a very good designer who understood how we were going to use this kitchen. All 3 of us were going to be cooking. And so the circulation can be designed to facilitate it. There's no question that there are design solutions that will encourage the sharing of the labor.
And the Obama question?
And the Obama question is, well, they don't listen to me. I do advise them anyway, and I do have friends who work in the White House, and I've encouraged them to talk about what's happened with Michelle Obama. I mean, whatever progressive work is being done on food in this administration is by and large coming from her office and her effort, the Let's Move campaign, which started out in a very promising way with a discussion of the importance of food, of farmers markets, of agriculture. They planted a garden, which I think was a really significant act. They ripped up part of the White House lawn and planted a garden. And it's beautiful. I mean, I've seen it. But over time, something interesting happened, which is the food industry came to Michelle Obama and very concerned about what she was doing.
They didn't like it.
They didn't like it at all. And she was very tough on them at the beginning. If you go back and read the speech she gave the grocery manufacturers of America,
really fantastic.
about a year in, it is a radical piece of rhetoric, a real challenge to them on their marketing, on their formulation, and they were really freaked out by this. And their response was very clever. And they went to her and they said, "We want to help. How can we help?" And they drew her into a conversation about reformulating processed food, which I think is one of the great dead ends in policy. Because we know what happens when you reformulate processed food. Essentially, you hand people a health claim that they put on their food and they use it to sell more crap. We saw this with the low-fat campaign when we re-engineered our food supply to remove the fat. It turned out to be based on bad science. But regardless, even if the science were good, when you remove the fat, you add more refined carbohydrates to make up for it, more salt too. And what happens is people see low fat on a box of chips or whatever it is, and they think, I'm going to have twice as much. And we binged on low-fat food, and we got fat on low-fat food. So slightly better processed food is a trap, I think. And I don't know how Michelle Obama could have avoided going down that path, because the First Lady can't tell the food industry to bug off. You can't avoid getting in that conversation. But I think it's diluted what was a terrific effort, and could still be a terrific effort, around these negotiations with Walmart and the various processed food companies, which also has the effect of legitimizing processed food. And I think that's really what I'm troubled by.
I have the lady at the back there. Can you say who you are again, please?
Hello, my name's Susan Parham. I think what's interesting about cooking is that it's place-based. People who cook tend to think about where stuff comes from. And they might also walk to buy the ingredients. And I wonder if you think at all about the interplay between how you get the stuff in to cook and the people who are actually cooking, and about that kind of localism.
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think one of the important, I talked about how rewarding cooking is. One of the key rewards is you know more about where your food comes from. You have more control over the food chain that you're drawing from. You're less likely to be consuming horse meat when you think you're consuming beef. And that, Wendell Berry, who's a great hero of mine, writer, farmer, said years ago that eating is an agricultural act. It's a powerful idea, and he's right. But cooking even more so, because the eater doesn't have the kind of information, doesn't know whether this beef came off a pasture or out of a feedlot, in the way that the cook, who's making those decisions, who has the ingredient labels, who is, if they're going to the farmer's market, is engaging with the farmer. There's so much more power and so much more control that you gain when you cook. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
We'll have someone in the middle next, over there. And then here.
Hi, Laura Wathen. Going back to the kitchen designers question, what would be your view generally on government intervention? I know in sort of food standards and things like that, I know, say, for example, Mayor Bloomberg's effort in the US to ban large drinks. Do you think there's a happy medium there where something can be worked out, or do you think the food industry is always going to get round it?
The role of the state, you mean?
The role of the state,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Well, it's funny, I've been asked that in the last day, because there's also this new proposal in Manchester, I guess, to force chip shops to close during school hours if they're near schools. And my reaction to all of these proposals is this. We have a public health crisis around food. It threatens to bankrupt us as a society. rates of obesity, rates of type 2 diabetes, heart disease. You know, in America, 75% of healthcare spending is on preventable chronic diseases, most of which are linked to diet, okay? This is a big problem. The reason Mayor Bloomberg got so engaged on the question of soda was that when he took office, he looked at the books and he saw that the biggest budgetary crisis was in the public hospital system in New York. And he said, well, how can we get control of these costs? And someone said, well, for every new case of type 2 diabetes that's diagnosed in New York, it costs your government $425,000 over the life of that child. So if you can reduce type 2 diabetes, you can solve this problem. And he says, how do you do that? He said, well, the simplest way is reduce soda consumption. And he went about it, trying to tax soda, trying to regulate the portion size, and he got lambasted for it. I think we need to experiment. I think that we don't know if any of these interventions are going to work, but the proof is in the pudding. And we need to try that. As you know, weird as these ideas might sound to us, to our ears. But changing the portion size of soda, and the idea was you couldn't sell it in 32-ounce containers anymore. I know, 32-ounce containers. It had to be 16 ounces. But you could get a second or a third, all you wanted. But you just would have that, you'd pause for a second and think, am I really thirsty? Do I really want more? This is not radical social engineering. This is what the behavioral economics call a nudge, right? A little change in the environment that may produce big changes in behavior. The fact is, we recoil at social engineering by the government, but for some reason we accept it by industry. Social engineering is going on every time you walk into the supermarket. The fact that the sweetened cereals are at eye level and the plain unreconstructed oatmeal is down by your feet is social engineering. And we're not offended by that. Yet we're offended as soon as the mayor says, no, 16-ounce cups. So my take is we should be equally offended. If we're going to be offended by social engineering, let's look at how corporations are doing. But in the meantime, let's try these experiments and see if they help us solve this problem.
Very good. We'll have one from over here. There's a guy in the middle at the back with a beard.
Hi, my name is John Gandy. I work here at the RSA. I just wanted to ask about education and cooking. I left school without even knowing how to boil an egg, or without having been taught at school how to boil an egg. So I wondered if you thought there was a particular way that we can encourage the reintroduction of cooking as a class in school.
We ought to just explain, I think Michael does know this, that we stopped formal education of cooking in English schools. Wales and Northern Ireland still has it, interestingly. And their obesity rates are higher. So let me just declare a little interest.
Interesting.
We'll have a longer discussion. But it's a very important thing. I was telling Michael earlier, we're sort of waiting for an announcement any day from the English government about cooking at schools. But what's your view?
I think it's very important. I think we need to, especially now that we have a generation that may not have learned how to cook from their parents, that there are few life skills more important than knowing how to cook your food. And that if it's not happening in the culture at large, it would be wonderful if it happened in the schools. It's also work, so-called, that kids love to do. I've been in cooking classes. We have some of them, and they're deeply engaged. It's a way to teach not just cooking, but teach about nature, teach about botany, teach about anatomy, teach about maths. So much. Food is a wonderful medium for learning about the world. I mean, that's what I've learned as a writer. I never expected to write 3 or 4 books on this subject. I thought I'd write one and move on. But food implicates us in so many systems and helps us understand so many of the systems that organize our lives, natural and cultural and economic. And so I think that there are few things more important to teach our kids than about food. Cooking, growing it also. I think gardening is a very useful thing to teach kids. And they love it, and especially in middle school, where they're really not prepared. I mean, middle schoolers are almost unteachable. You know, they really should just go out and get a job for a couple years. They're just too busy with other things. But you can engage them with sensory education. And what is more sensory than growing and cooking food?
Very good. We'll have one at the front here, and then we'll have the gentleman right at the back. Yeah, I'm going to have you later. We've got time for 3 questions.
Hi, Lucy Wills, RSA Fellow and MA student. I've been looking at how the design industry can be more effective, and I found your story of the Burbank potato in Botany of Desire, just this breakthrough of, my God, is this how we treat potatoes? Are we treating people the same way? So my question for you is simply this: how far can you take the metaphor of food? You say that, it's a great way of learning about the world. How can we use that? What's the next stage on? Thank you.
In 1 minute.
Yeah, that's a book.
It's actually 3.
Yeah, it's true. It's still one of the things that I got interested in when I was doing this was, as I alluded to, is fermentation and bacteria. And as I delved into our relationship to bacteria, which food brings you into, fermentation especially, it completely revolutionized my understanding of human identity. You're only 10% human. You're 90% microbes. You're a superorganism. The first person plural needs to be adopted by all of us. And it's not trivial because as scientists, there's a scientist I quote in the piece who says, we need to understand health as a collective property of the human-associated microbiota. So food can take us places we haven't gone yet, and an understanding of and talk about our implication in the world. This is telling you the environment is not just out there, it's passing through you and is part of you. And you have a wilderness here as well as one out there. So I don't think we're done in coming to terms with how food connects us to the world.
Very good. We're here to plug Michael's book, but I'll plug one of mine, which actually goes into your question at great length, called Ecological Public Health. And the critical issue, hence my interruption of Michael earlier, the fusion of, not quite fusion, but beginning of fusion of the food and the pharmaceutical industry is around bacteria.
Yeah.
And we're seeing already a crisis of that in antimicrobial resistance, which is going to be a huge issue. The gentleman right at the back. And then the lady at the front.
You get the last
in
question.
The hat. So keep it short.
Paul Jarman, Fellow of the Society and retired primary school head teacher. My question relates to the question before last. It's my view that children have their beliefs fixed very often before they leave primary school, before 9, 10, 11 years of age. And I've worked for many, many years trying to get cooking and the production of food in a minor way into schools. Would you not agree that it is crucial to get these aspects into a national curriculum and that young children have the experience of both growing and preparing food, and alongside that there is a national push for education of their parents?
Well, I have a short answer to your good long question, which is yes, absolutely. I think we need to start early, and that is the place to engage kids with food. And I've seen it. I've seen it with my own son. He would eat things out of the garden he would never eat on a plate, and things he cooked he was willing to eat, even exotic things. I just think that to let our children leave our homes when they head off to university without having this critical life skill we work so hard to teach them how to drive safely and how to we teach them about safe sex and alcohol and drug use and all these kind of things because we know it's so important to their health. This is equally important.
I think the missing variable there is confidence. Confidence
Yes.
is the key issue.
I agree. I think
That's the key
daunted.
issue. The lady at the front, you'll say who you are.
My name is Irena Rachkovska.
Can you put it to you?
Irena Rachkovska. I've wondered whether you have researched how specific diets can help to prevent diseases such as cancer. And having looked you up, I know that you have a very famous brother-in-law Michael J. Fox, who unfortunately suffers from Parkinson. Did you therefore perhaps investigate how diet could help people suffering from Parkinson's?
Thank you.
You know, I mean, you open up a very complex subject about the links between diet and health. We have very good reason to believe that the full range of chronic diseases are powerfully affected by diet. Not all cancers, but many cancers. About 30% of cancers have been linked to diet. So what kind of diet? Well, a diet that's heavily plant-based. We know people who eat a pound of plants a day have half the rates of cancer of other people. We don't know why, but we know that we see this correlation. Diet has an enormous bearing on our health. And we know what we need to know to change our diet for our health, even though we don't know the mechanisms exactly. And going back to this issue of the microbiota, it turns out that may explain some of these links. The fact that we're not feeding our large intestine, the fermentation within. One of the hallmarks of processed food is it's readily absorbed in the upper gastrointestinal tract. It's refined carbohydrates and fats, and that's one of the things we've done. We figured out a diet for the 10%, that is human, and we've ignored the 90%. And that may have a tremendous bearing on things like cancer, autoimmune disease especially. Parkinson's remains a mystery. There is some evidence that certain environmental toxins at certain windows of exposure in your life can set it off. And one of the curious things about Michael Fox's is he was part of a cohort of people who lived in a part of Canada where many people were perhaps exposed to some environmental pesticides, and perhaps that is, but proving those things is almost impossible. But diet does help with symptoms. I don't remember if it's a high protein or a low protein diet that's particularly good, but there's so much to learn. We've just begun to understand the links between what we eat and our health. But that said, we know enough. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, on that very positive, and what he was really wanting to give was a 10-hour lecture there on the difference between causation and population change. But luckily,
thank
he
God
stopped
we don't
himself.
have time for that.
But that is the distinction: population causation and individual causation, the two very different things. Anyway, look, we're 2 minutes over. Please give a very big thanks to...
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.